You've probably heard this silly pun. What do you call a bunch of chess masters in the lobby of a hotel bragging about their tour victories? They are chestnuts boasting in an open foyer. I told you that it was silly. When we come to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 through 13, the Apostle Paul also takes to some boasting. Not about being a chess master, but about being an apostle of Jesus. It's something he would have preferred not to have done. But the situation at the church in Corinth has driven him to it. False apostles had wormed their way into the church and apparently were not only boasting about their own credentials, but were attacking the Apostle Paul for his supposed lack of credentials. They questioned Paul's calling and his effectiveness as an apostle, and their slander was negatively impacting his relationship with the church. Let me reference again a quote from last week from David Garland in the New American Commentary, who wrote, "The circumstances have driven him to this extremity. Boasting is clearly unwise, but if he ignores the slurs of the rivals who have maligned him, the church might have been persuaded that they were on target. If he stoops to their level of boasting, he's a fool. But if he does not defend himself, he might lose the congregation to even greater fools." Forced into a corner, Paul feels that he must opt for this foolishness, and he introduces his so-called boasts. I want you to understand, though, that as we come to chapter 12 this morning, that there is nothing arrogant about the Apostle Paul. Unlike the false apostles who boasted to promote their own importance and for their own benefit, the only reason that Paul chose this tactic was for the benefit of the church. If there had been any question about his commitment to Jesus or his calling, let's look again at the end of chapter 10, beginning verse 22 from last week. He asked, "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so, in far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without numbers, often in dangers of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers in the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure." And then verse 28, he says, "And apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me for concern for all of the churches." What a statement. It's as if he's saying to the false apostles, here is the evidence of my commitment. Where is yours? This is what being an apostle of Jesus has cost me thus far in my life. What has it cost you? But then in chapter 12, he ups his level of boasting. So in verse 1, he says, "Boasting is necessary, though it's not profitable, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord." Among the other credentials, the false apostles highly prized visions and revelations as signs of a true apostle. In the book of Colossians, Paul wrote, and I'm going to read to you from the Contemporary English Version. He writes, "Don't be cheated by people who make a show of acting humble and who worship angels. They brag about seeing visions, but it's all nonsense." Paul is essentially saying, you want to know about visions? Then let me do some boasting. And Paul relays something here in 2 Corinthians. Now, it seems to be that Paul had experienced or was given at least 6 visions in the book of Acts. And in Galatians, he also says that he received the gospel through a vision. He writes, "For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached to me is not according to men, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." But what he experiences here in 2 Corinthians 12 is, as John MacArthur says, the most amazing and remarkable of them all. And what's remarkable is not so much the details, because there's not a lot of detail given. But what Paul does is describe this vision, first of all, as a privilege. Look at verse 2 again. "I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak." Now let's take a few seconds and just think about Paul's experience here. The who of this vision or experience is Paul. He says, "I know a man in Christ," and that's a description of a believer. Paul is saying, "I know a Christian," and he's really talking about himself, an example of Iliism, which is referring to yourself in the third person. Now, why would he use this method of describing this vision? Well, apparently, Jewish rabbis were accustomed to speaking about themselves in the third person, and Paul may have simply been adopting that approach as he relates this experience. But he may have chosen to describe himself this way because, first of all, he was reluctant to bring up the vision at all, and he wanted to minimize the effect of any perceived boasting. He does mention it, though, because of his love for the church and because of the false teachers' claims to vision. One commentary suggested only the greatest figures of Scripture were ever snatched up to the heavens, and Paul has no interest in ranking himself with these saints. He simply wants to drive pompous rivals from the ranks of the Corinthians. He therefore avoids an egocentric form of expression since he is already acutely conscious of the foolishness of self-praise. The who is Paul, the when was 14 years earlier, which was probably during Paul's unrecorded ministry in Tarsus, which would have been right before Barnabas came and asked Paul to go to Antioch with him. In other words, this was way before his missionary journeys. It was something that he apparently had experienced early in life, but hadn't revealed to anyone, and had kept it quiet for 14 years. The how of this vision wasn't clear to Paul. Whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, God knows. Now, when I read this, I just make the assumption that Paul was describing a vision, but Paul wasn't certain whether it was a vision or not. As mentioned, he did have visions. But in this case, he couldn't tell whether this was a vision or whether God had transported him physically. Have you ever awakened from a dream that seemed so real? And once you realized that it was a dream, you were disappointed or maybe relieved? Well, Paul wasn't dreaming. It was so real that he couldn't tell if he had physically gone somewhere or if it was an out-of-the-body experience. The where was heaven. Paul says he was caught up to the third heaven, verse 2, and in verse 4 he describes it as paradise. The third heaven is not a degree of glory taught in Mormon doctrine, which says that there are three main divisions in heaven or 3 degrees of glory. For example, one of the Mormon holy books teaches there are 3 kingdoms of glory: the celestial kingdom, the terrestrial kingdom, and the telestial kingdom. The glory we inherit will depend on the depth of our conversion expressed by our obedience to the Lord's commandments. It will depend on the manner in which we have received the testimony of Jesus. That's not what Paul's talking about. The word heaven in Scripture is used to describe the immediate atmosphere, outer space, and also the place where God is. Jesus called heaven the Father's house. Not too long before Jesus would be betrayed and arrested, he told his disciples, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." Can we just pause for a moment and think about the significance of what Jesus says? Jesus said that in the Father's house, there are many dwelling places. There is an old gospel song that says, "I've got a mansion over the hilltop in that bright land where we'll never grow old." I really can't verify if the word here for dwelling place is mansion or not, but mansion sounds a lot more lavish than saying, in my Father's house are many rooms or apartments or condominiums. I'm glad he didn't say timeshares. That creates all kinds of theological issues. But does it really matter what the word means exactly? See, the most important part of what Jesus said is, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. The promise for every true child of God is that one day we're going to be with Jesus. We're going to live with him in the Father's house. And that's why it's completely true to say of a believer who dies, they have gone home. They've gone to their real home. Many of you are grieving the recent death of a loved one, and you're having to experience the sorrow and the pain and the loneliness that death imposes upon relationships. You're having to adjust and will continue to have to adjust in living without your loved one. You are experiencing a sense of separation and loss. And without wanting to minimize or in any way take lightly your sorrow, could I encourage you to take comfort in the truth that if your loved one was a believer in Jesus, they've gone home. They are in the Father's house. This is where Paul was taken. And notice Paul says that he was caught up, a word that means to snatch away or sneeze, or not sneeze, seize, or to remove forcibly. It's the same word that Paul uses when he's describing something yet future for the church of Jesus Christ that is often referred to by theologians as the rapture of the church. Paul was raptured up to the third heaven. New American Commentary again says the verb suggests that Paul's experience was an involuntary one in which God took the initiative rather than one brought about any preparation or special techniques. The experience was not something to be sought or initiated, and therefore was not something that he could repeat whenever he wanted to. It's something God did and something only God could explain. Paul seems to be emphasizing as strongly as possible that he's not special because of this vision of God. He didn't have it because he was an OT level 8, which is an operating thetan level 8, the highest level you can be in the Church of Scientology. Google it. His experience didn't come around through prayer or fasting or medication or drugs. It wasn't Paul, the mystic, seeking God. It was God seeking Paul. The who was Paul. The when was 14 years earlier. The how's not clear. The where is heaven. And the what was, and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. Inexpressible and permitted, not permitted to speak means the same thing. Whatever he heard, and from whomever he heard it, Paul was not allowed to repeat it. So look at verse 5. On behalf of such a man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast except in regard to my weaknesses. For if I do not wish to boast, I will not be foolish, for I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain from this, so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. Paul felt it necessary to mention his experience, but he wasn't going to dwell on it. He wasn't going to try to make himself out as being more important or to get the upper hand on the false apostles. He isn't trying to impress the Corinthians to gain their approval. Paul wasn't saying, I'm a great apostle and I rest my case on my vision. Now, it's doubtful that any of the super apostles could claim that they had an equal experience, because Paul was snatched up to heaven, which was a unique privilege, a privilege that came with a price that resulted in a problem. Look at verse 7. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. With this privilege came an accountability, and unlike the false apostles who arrogantly boasted about their visions and revelations, Paul was given something to keep him humble. I'm reminded of the deacon in a little church where they had just gotten a new pastor, and he told one of the other deacons, God will keep him humble and we'll keep him poor. Paul was not given a vision for him to exalt, but to keep him humble. Paul was given a vision, and then he was given a problem. And that problem he describes here as a thorn in the flesh. What was the thorn in the flesh? After many years of theological training and careful biblical research, here's my answer. I don't know. Can I say that again? We don't know. And the Bible doesn't give us any description other than the fact that it's called a messenger of Satan. Now, guesses include that the thorn was a physical problem, something like poor eyesight, speech impediment, epilepsy, migraine headaches, or a malarial fever common in the eastern Mediterranean area. Other opinions is that the thorn in the flesh may have been something more personal or psychological or even people, but the suggestion of a wife or mother-in-law are not part of that at all. The Greek word for thorn is stake. It's not a little tiny thorn, perhaps found on a rose, but a shaft of wood sharpened at one end, used in battle to impale someone. Whatever or whoever this thorn was, it was real and it was painful. And Paul felt like he was being stabbed by a sharpened wooden stake. Notice, it had been given to him. A word that Paul uses in other places to describe receiving a special gift from God. The purpose of the thorn was to keep him humble. Opinions conflict in that some say the messenger of Satan did not come from God, and others say that it did. Whatever the case is, God at least permitted it. Paul understands that this origin of his thorn is ultimately from God. It is a way to keep him humble, as a shield to protect Paul from the detrimental effects of a powerful ego. Paul sensed that his suffering from the thorn ultimately comes from God, even if it was administered by Satan, and that it was for his own discipline. The thorn was a problem that was given as a result of a privilege. And notice in verse 8, it leads to a prayer. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. Whatever this thorn in the flesh was, Paul wanted it gone. He wanted it taken from his life. He didn't ask God to help him deal with it. He asked God to take it away. He implored God to remove it. In other words, he begged God to remove it. Not once, but 3 times. Shortly before his betrayal and arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed 3 times to the Father, making the same request within a short period. But Paul seems to have prayed this prayer on 3 separate occasions, asking him to remove the thorn. Now, it's speculation on my part, but I wonder if those occasions were when his life was really, really hard, when the circumstances were bad, even when Paul may have felt discouraged and defeated, when he was physically, emotionally, and spiritually drained, when he couldn't take it anymore because of this thorn, and he begged God to take it from him because it was hurting him the most. Paul prayed, but God didn't remove it. Paul pleaded, and God said, no. You do realize that no is an answer to prayer? We may not think of it this way, but it is. We ask God for something or to do something, and we don't get the answer that we want, so we complain that God doesn't hear us or answer our prayers, when the truth is, God did answer our prayer, but He said no. So why would God say no to His children? The broad answer is because He loves you. Even at a human level, loving, responsible parents do not give their children everything they want or permit their children to do everything they want to do. The parent that does that is not raising a child, they're raising a delinquent. Some prayers do not receive positive responses because God, in His wisdom, knows that something else is far better for us. James Merritt, in a sermon, wrote, there was nothing wrong with the prayer and there was nothing wrong with God. It wasn't that God didn't hear Paul's prayer, and it wasn't that God didn't care. Paul got an answer to his prayer. It simply wasn't the answer he wanted. It was the answer he needed. Paul wanted God to deal with his problem by subtraction, but instead, God dealt with the problem by addition. C.S. Lewis is quoted as saying, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pains. It is His megaphone to arouse a deaf world. What a contrast between the false apostles who equated God's blessing with prosperity and power and ease, and Paul who has a thorn in the flesh. Paul had to live with this thorn in the flesh, or more spike in his side, but God did not leave Paul on his own or without resource, because though God did not give Paul what Paul asked for, God did give Paul what he needed. And so God provided, or God gave him a provision. Look at verses 9 and 10. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Paul prayed for the absence of pain. God gave him the presence of grace. And I want you to listen carefully. It does not matter what happens to us. It doesn't matter what we will experience. It doesn't matter how weak we may become. God's grace will always be sufficient to meet your need. You know, contemporary Christian music gets criticized sometimes for weak theology, self-absorbed lyrics, and repetitious style, not completely without some deserved criticism. But I would argue that not all contemporary music deserves that criticism, or that all hymns don't deserve it. We'll save this discussion for another time. We've not sung this song for a while, and I kind of wish we had sung it this morning. It's a refrain of a song written by Chris Tomlin, who says, your grace is enough. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough for me. Is it simple? Yes. Is it repetitive? Yes. Is it good theology? It is absolutely on target. And we would do well to continually affirm it in our lives. God's grace is sufficient. He supplies everything that we need. Charles Haddon Spurgeon was troubled about a thorn in his life, and we're not told what it was, even though we know that Spurgeon suffered often from deep bouts of depression. The words of 2 Corinthians 12:9 came to him, my grace is sufficient for you. And Spurgeon began to use his imagination, and he imagined that he was transported to the bank of a flowing river. He saw a little fish drinking away in the river, and then all of a sudden the little fish stopped and said, I mustn't drink too much or there won't be any left. And the river replied, drink on, little fish. My waters are sufficient for you. Then Mr. Spurgeon said he imagined that he was standing beside one of Joseph's great granaries in Egypt, and a little mouse was feeding there, and it stopped its meal and said, I shouldn't eat too much now or there won't be enough for tomorrow. Feed on, little mouse, said the storehouse. My grain is sufficient for you. And next, Spurgeon said he imagined himself on the top of a great mountain, and he saw a man filling his lungs with fresh, invigorating air. And the man stopped and said, I must be careful not to use up too much oxygen, or there will be no supply for future needs. And the vast mountain amusingly replied, breathe on, little man. My winds are sufficient for you. Then Charles Haddon Spurgeon said he was brought back to this great text, my grace is sufficient for you. And he suddenly understood, as he had never had before, that God's grace was inexhaustible. In English, the word sufficient is a predicate adjective describing grace. Grace is the key word, the important word, and sufficient helps to describe it. Grace is the king, and sufficient is the commoner bowing down before it. Have I lost you? The word order in the original language is sufficient is my grace. And sufficient's not an adjective, it's a verb, an active verb, a continually active verb. Grace isn't being minimized or made unimportant, but grammatically, sufficient is the main focus of the phrase because the sufficiency of God's grace brings God's power along with it. I don't know if that excites you, but it does me. And it did Paul. How do I know? Look at verses 9 and 10. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, I am strong. Paul went from a privilege that brought a problem that led to a prayer that was met with a provision that resulted in a persuasion. See, what's so incredible to me and amazing to me is Paul's attitude shift. I don't know if it was immediate because, after all, he had prayed 3 times for God to remove the thorn in his flesh. Neither do I think Paul took the attitude of, oh, well, 3 strikes and I'm out. I might as well just accept this, and begrudgingly gave up hope, disappointed in and rejected by the God he served. No, Paul's praying didn't change the situation, it changed him. He does a 180-degree turn from praying for a thorn in the flesh to be removed from his life to not only accepting it, but embracing it and boasting about it. Look again at some of the choices of words in these verses. Gladly, boast, well content. And notice that he is well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties. Maybe Paul experienced each one of them, or all of them, as thorns, but it didn't matter because God provided the sufficiency of his grace. God gave Paul a thorn in the flesh, a constant reminder of weakness, so that he might be continually reminded of his dependency on God. Many years ago, our church hosted our state evangelism conference. And the keynote speaker was Dr. Jack McGorman, professor of New Testament at my alma mater, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'd actually taken a course from Dr. McGorman in the book of Romans, and it had been several years earlier, so I doubted that even if I introduced myself, he would know who I was. But I was still kind of excited that he was coming. And on the night of the conference, I introduced myself to him and told him about sitting in his class at Romans. Dr. McGorman was born in 1920 in Nova Scotia, Canada, and he moved across the United States to Caribou, Maine at the age 7. From 1937 to 1938, he studied at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. But his academic pursuits were hindered by the onset of a severe lung disease. And in May 1939, McGorman checked into a hospital for 1 month's observation. He stayed there for more than 2 years. In 1941, despite the aid of a renowned Harvard Medical School doctor, McGorman was dismissed from the hospital as inoperable. Following the doctor's advice to leave the Northeast for a high and dry climate of Arizona, McGorman moved south. By the time he had reached Austin, Texas, he'd run out of money. Fortunately, it was there that he recovered from his illness. And in 1945, he enrolled in Southwestern Seminary. Now, by the time of this evangelism conference, Dr. McGorman had retired. He asked me if there was a place where he could spend a few minutes alone before the conference began, and so I offered him my office. It was kind of cool and kind of humbling to think that one of my seminary professors was in my office preparing himself to speak. That night, Dr. McGorman spoke from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 about a thorn in the flesh. Now, I don't remember a lot of what he said, not because it wasn't good, but just because I don't remember. But I do remember he candidly shared that he was experiencing some difficulty in his life that he didn't expect to be experiencing at this age of his life. Again, I don't recall all the details, but it involved one of his children, I think a divorce, moving back home with a grandchild. What did stick with me was something he said about believers who experience struggle and difficulty and react in a negative way. Dr. McGorman said something like, what they don't realize is that the thorn room is on the way to the throne room. I've never forgotten that. The thorn room is on the way to the throne room. Dr. McGorman went home to be with the Lord in December 2021. He was 2 days shy of his 101st birthday. The thorn room is on the way to the throne room. Maybe you're in the thorn room this morning. David Biebel said, while for some spirituality is defined by what you know, God may be more concerned with how you handle what you do not know. Oswald Chambers wrote, a saint's life is in the hands of God as a bow and arrow in the hands of an archer. God is aiming at something the saint cannot see. He stretches and strains, and every now and again the saint says, I cannot stand anymore, but God doesn't heed. He goes on stretching until his purposes are in sight, and then he lets fly. I mentioned at the beginning of this study that I had some difficulty in choosing a title, but decided on 2 Corinthians, Strength Through Weakness. This title came from this verse, because not only is it a commentary on the entire book, but I really think it's one of, if not the key verse in the whole book. Strength through weakness. God's strength not just demonstrated, but perfected in our weaknesses. And I don't know all of what this means, but I have to tell you, it's really helping me. It's helping me not to be afraid to admit weakness. It's okay to confess that I don't have all of the answers or possess the strength or enough wisdom to handle all the problems, difficulties, and struggles. There's no shame in acknowledging our total dependence on and our need for God. We can trust that in our limitations, that in our lack of resources, that His grace is sufficient to meet our need. You see, it's not about us becoming stronger, but it's about Him experiencing His strength in and through us. Thomas Fuller is an English clergyman and historian who lived in the 17th century. He said, don't let your will roar when your power only whispers. That's especially relevant to what it means to be a Christian. It may not be the way that the world normally operates, but it's the exact opposite for believers in Jesus, because real strength, God's strength, is demonstrated in through our weakness. We're strong when we come to a place of abandonment to God's purpose and God's will in our lives. Someone wrote, faith does not operate in the realm of the possible. Faith begins where man's power ends. A long time ago, a Puritan believer prayed, reveal to me my weakness, that I may know my strength in Thee. Maybe that should be our prayer and our attitude as well. And He has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong.